listener production.
Hello, welcome to The Briefing. I'm Sasha Barbagat. 10 years ago this Sunday, the world's eyes were drawn to a developing situation at a cafe in Martin Place in Sydney. What was initially believed to be a potential bomb scare quickly unfolded into something more.
Then we began to fear the worst. We heard that there were hostages. We didn't know how many. We didn't know who they were being held by. But we knew that this wasn't a bomb scare. This was a really serious developing story.
The Briefing's Antoinette Lattouf was reporting live on the ground outside the Lindt Cafe siege on the day. And in the second half of this episode, she joins Helen Smith to reflect on the events of the day and what Australia's relationship to terror is a decade on. First though, time for the headlines with Chris Spiru on Friday, December 13th.
Morning, Sash. Morning, everybody. Peter Dutton will today unveil how much his nuclear energy plan will cost. According to News Corp, that figure will be $331 billion, while 9 newspapers claim the coalition will build 7 full-scale nuclear reactors. And that's a change from the initial proposal we got earlier this year, which was centred around building small modular reactors, which are supposed to be quicker to get up and running. The opposition will promise massive savings with this plan, including cheaper energy bills, lower running costs of businesses, and a more resilient economy. But there are rumblings within the party that this strategy is politically risky because it will be years before these savings can be passed on, Sash.
Yeah, according to the CSIRO's latest Gen Cost report, it'd take at least 15 years to build a reactor. That doesn't factor in the legal hurdles that the coalition is going to have to clear as well to get this off the ground. So how is the coalition going to try to convince voters that this is the best energy plan for Australia? Well, it is set to seize on recent modelling by Frontier Economics, which were paid for by the party, that put a price tag of $642 billion on Labor's renewable energy plan. Now, the Energy Minister, Chris Bowen, has rejected that figure. He stands by the energy grid operator's forecast of $122 billion. Now, as we've already seen in this debate, there are a lot of conflicting figures and claims that get thrown around by the major parties, with Australia's energy future shaping up to be one of the most contentious issues of the upcoming election. It's going to be really hard for voters to wade through all of the different figures that are going to get thrown around. We just heard there, that's a $500 billion difference in how much something's going to cost. Who do you trust? Who do you listen to? I suppose, going to the scientific bodies that do the full scale research on timings and costings and all of that is a good place to start. Look, coalition MPs are going to be briefed on this plan in a party room meeting this morning at 10 a.m. Now, the plan will also see coal-fire plants continue to operate while the reactors are built. And that's important because Labor's plan is to start phasing them out. Where can we expect to see these reactors built? We already know that they're going to go up on current or former coal-fired power stations. So they're in WA, Queensland, New South Wales, Victoria and SA. And there is a promise that energy will flow by the mid-2030s. However, high-profile energy commentator Simon Holmes-A-Court told a parliamentary inquiry yesterday that there was, quote, not a hope in hell of nuclear reactors producing power before 2040. So again, he said, she said a little bit in this debate. So it comes down to listening to all of the arguments and deciding for yourself who you believe, who you trust. There was polling mentioned in one of the articles. Resolve Political Monitor found that only 20% of voters are in favour of taxpayer investments or subsidies for nuclear power. So not many people want to pay for it themselves. And it also showed that renewable energy was more popular with this group of people surveyed. 45% of voters backed subsidies for rooftop solar and 34% supported subsidies for home batteries. And that is something that Labor is looking at including in its energy plan for next year. So Labor is going to have to come out with something. We'll see what they say.
To Queensland now, the new Liberal government has delivered on its key election promise, passing new hardline youth justice laws. The laws, a key part of the party's adult crime, adult time policy, will see juvenile offenders who are charged with serious crimes, including murder, manslaughter, serious assault and robbery, face tougher maximum sentences. What this looks like in practice, Sash, that means an offender as young as 10 years old who is found guilty of murder specifically could face a mandatory life sentence with a minimum non-parole period of 20 years. Previously, the maximum penalty for murder for 10 to 17-year-olds was 10 years in jail, with life imprisonment only considered if the crime was, quote, particularly heinous.
The laws also remove the principle of detention as a last resort, which is a key cornerstone of how Western democracies approach crime and sentencing. It prioritises things like community service and fines over jail time. So this is a complete departure of that. The LNP did campaign heavily on this issue, the Premier saying the laws are supported by victims and the community, and they were voted in very convincingly. So they feel they've got the mandate to bring these laws in. The 35 Labor MPs who were present did vote in favour of the Making Queensland Safer bill. The state's only Greens MP, Michael Berkman, and independent MP for Noosa, Sandy Bolton, voted against it. Australia's Commissioner for Children has described the laws as an international embarrassment, while the UN says they disregard international conventions on the human rights of children and violate international law. So if you're wondering about the data, the latest we have from the ABS shows that youth crime has halved in Queensland across the past 14 years, and it hit its lowest rate in recorded history in 2022. That could be swayed by COVID. COVID was a big factor in lowering a lot of crime numbers, but it has remained relatively steady since.
Yeah, and the interesting thing here, and where the evidence kind of goes against this law that's just passed, is that punishment is only one incentive to not reoffend. This is something that a lot of youth crime experts have said. And while there are serious crimes going on in Queensland perpetrated by young offenders, sending them to prison is one thing. It's now a matter of getting them further supports. That's what they need now to not continue offending. So it'll be very interesting to see if those supports come in, because in my opinion, and in a lot of experts' opinions, that's the only thing that's going to fix this problem. And Donald Trump has been named Times Person of the Year for a second time. In its announcement, the magazine, which has been naming the person who has wielded the most influence in the previous 12 months for the last 97 years, Sash, this has been going on for 97 years, they said in many years that choice is a difficult one. In 2024, it was not. The president-elect was also handed the nod in 2016 when he first won the keys to the White House.
I have to say, Time magazine getting this honor for the second time. I think I like it better this time, actually.
Yes, and if you needed reminding of what a massive year 2024 has been for Trump, here's a very quick recap. The Republicans swept his party's primaries. He became the first American president to be convicted of felony charges. He survived an assassination attempt, and he won the US election, making him just the second to serve non-consecutive terms. So you can't deny his influence in 2024. Time released its shortlist earlier this week. Kamala Harris, Elon Musk, Princess Catherine were named in contention for the accolade, but it's gone to Trump. And now he did do an interview with Time as part of this. And one of the things he talked about was, what he's going to do when he hits the White House. So January 20, he's going to be inaugurated. And he says he is going to pardon most of the January 6 rioters within the first hour of being sworn in. And then he said maybe within the first 5 minutes. So he's making that his top priority.
Yeah, and sticking with pardons, Joe Biden has pardoned 39 non-violent criminals and reduced the sentences of roughly 1,500 Americans who were released from prisons and placed in home detention during the pandemic. So around that time, federal prisons were filling up and there was a coronavirus outbreak, so they sent a whole bunch as part of emergency measures home to serve out home detention. So these people now have received reduced sentences. And interestingly, this is pretty big because now Biden holds the record for the largest single-day act of clemency in modern history. So he's eclipsed Obama's 330 pardons, which he issued shortly before he left office in 2017. And Biden's promising over the coming weeks to continue to review clemency petitions. It's an interesting space that he's still playing in, considering the blowback and backlash he received after pardoning his son. So, I don't know. Interesting stuff coming out of the US as well.
I think it's the one thing they can do before they leave office. So they're like, you know what? Screw it. I'm signing those pardons.
Yeah.
Chris, thank you so much for being here for the headlines. Next up, we're getting into our deep dive with Antoinette Lattouf and Helen Smith, and they're looking back at the Lindt Cafe siege 10 years on.
You're speaking with Sam.
Yeah, I'm sure the Lindt shop on the corner of Martin Place is being held up by somebody. I was trying to get in there. The doors have been locked. There are people inside the building, and I'm sure a man gestured to me to get away, and he had a blue bag, and it looked like he had a shotgun in there.
So it's the Lindt shop, as in the chocolate? L-I...
Shop. There are police here now. Just on the corner there. On the corner there, that round building there. I think my work colleagues might be trapped inside. They held signs up saying closed, but there's a man in there with a blue bag and it looked like it had a shotgun in it.
10 years ago, the Lindt Cafe siege took place on the 15th of November 2014. Man Haron Monis took hostage of 18 people for 16 hours inside Sydney's Martin Place, which was later declared an act of terrorism. The 16-hour siege ended in the deaths of 2 hostages, Tori, Dawson and Katrina Dawson, the gunman, Monis, and resulted in multiple people being injured by gunfire during the raid. The image that made global headlines was the unveiling of a black and white flag bearing the Islamic creed held up by hostages to the Lindt Cafe's window.
There, we've just got some breaking news. There's a police operation underway in the heart of the city. One block of Martin Place has been cordoned off and several police vehicles are at the scene. An ABC reporter has seen one officer with a weapon drawn.
Just here at Channel 7, all of the staff here are being told to get away from the windows.
And this is frightening and chilling stuff. What you're watching is live. It's happening here in Martin Place.
Guns have been drawn.
100 metres that way, please.
There are dozens and dozens of police. Some are very heavily armed in helmets and Kevlar suits. But when I was allowed a little closer, I could see inside the Lindt building a woman with her hands up against the glass.
At the time, Tony Abbott was the Prime Minister of Australia, and he addressed the country on what they knew about the gunman.
What we do know is that the perpetrator was well known to state and Commonwealth authorities. He had a long history of violent crime, infatuation with extremism and mental instability. We know that he sent offensive letters to the families of Australian soldiers killed in Afghanistan. We also know that he posted graphic extremist material online.
After the tragedy, former New South Wales coroner Michael Barnes, who is now the New South Wales Crime Commissioner, led an 18-month inquest into the siege, which resulted in a series of recommendations and findings. The key ones being that New South Wales police did not act quickly enough, the gunman should not have been granted bail at the time, calls for help from hostages went unanswered, and that the victims' families were treated insensitively. The briefing's Antoinette Lattouf was reporting on the ground at the time for SBS. She joins us now. Antoinette, can you take me back to that day? What were you doing before you got called down to Martin Place?
I remember it so vividly because I was heavily pregnant and I got a call from my executive producer as I was reversing out of the driveway at home, heading to the studios in Artarmon because I was reporting for SBS at the time. And it was a really hot day. And selfishly, I remember thinking, I'm so tired. Like, I'm heavily pregnant. It's really hot. I remember thinking to myself, I hope it's a slow news day and they'll spare me having to go out and do a story. Because if it is a slow news day, not every reporter gets sent out. And hopefully, I was thinking, I hope they feel sorry for me and they leave me alone. I honestly thought that. And I'll be able to sit in an air-conditioned office and have a quiet day. It was also because it's the end of the year. It was a general news fatigue point of the year, which we both understand in the lead up to Christmas. Everybody's tired. You're tired of world affairs, you're tired of news, you're tired of politics. And then I got a call from my executive producer at that time and said, don't come to the office, head straight to the city. I'll text you the details, but there is a bomb scare. And we want you to check it out. It's probably nothing, were the words I was told. And that's not to diminish what ended up happening, but it's to put in context that when you are a daily news reporter, and I was a crime reporter for many, many years, you often go to locations to suss things out and it ends up being a dead end. It ends up being nothing. So it dawned on me that, this is probably nothing because a bomb scare, like how often it's some alarm that went off in a building incorrectly. So ordinarily you would jump in a car with cameramen and head straight to somewhere if they felt that it was something that needed to be looked at straight away. But it was like, just go and suss it out. It's probably nothing. So that's how I was feeling. I was like, this is annoying. I'm just going to go check it out. And then I'll end up sitting in an air-conditioned office.
And your day couldn't have gone any more different, really. It's probably one of the biggest news days that we've seen in that period of time for a while. What was your initial reaction to what was happening when you got on the ground and when you realised, this is not just a bomb threat?
When I got there and I saw how much of the city had been cordoned off, because generally journos are allowed to go to a certain point, but if it's cordoned off, I was like, why are people evacuating the city? Why are office buildings evacuating? So as the seriousness escalated, I remember kicking off my heels because I was wearing high heels and I was thinking, strap in, you're going to be on your feet a lot. I was working barefoot and working with other journalists to figure out what was going on. And then we began to fear the worst. We heard that there were hostages. We didn't know how many. We didn't know who they were being held by. But we knew that this wasn't a bomb scare. This was a really serious developing story. And we had no idea of how it was going to go. But I remember calling back my colleagues at SBS going, are you going to send anybody else down here? They're like, the cameraman's on the way. We're sending as many people as we can. And that's what we saw. We just saw all news outlets descend on Martin Place to prepare for the worst.
And how did the day fold out? How many hours were you down there? What was, as you got more information kind of trickling in, what was that feeling on the ground?
Look, it was a mixture of uncertainty and the sense of this stuff doesn't happen in Australia. To, at the other end of the scale, oh my God, buildings in the city are going to blow up September 11 style. So it was a range of emotions, but I remember trying to be focused on the facts at hand and trying not to buy into the hysteria and everyone's worst fears. Then my phone started popping off. My husband, my parents, my siblings, because at the time there were also claims that the hostage taker had bombs planted throughout the rest of the city. And so at that point, people are worried about my welfare going, you're pregnant. I think I was 8 months pregnant at that point. You're pregnant. You should get out of there. Stuff's going to start exploding. Maybe because I was in survival mode and I hadn't really processed the magnitude of what could happen or what was about to happen, I was just, and maybe because I'd been in news a long time, I was like, let's just focus on what's at hand. And I'm not going to deal with hypotheticals and I heard and my uncle's brother overheard this and thinks this and knows somebody. And I was getting text messages, my neighbour knows somebody who in Parliament who knows this and overheard this. And I'm like, I'm not responding to hearsay. So I probably didn't digest. I wasn't scared ever at that point.
Yeah, so there wasn't a time that, as you said, you were so heavily pregnant. There wasn't a time where you thought, I need to get out of here.
I remember speaking to my executive producer at the time and she said, if you are concerned and worried about your safety, you can absolutely leave. I understand you're pregnant and you can leave. And I was like, no, I'll stay. And so I did.
And looking back on that, did that affect you at all?
I realised that I didn't process the magnitude and the loss and the sadness until afterwards. And I think a big part of that was one of the victims, Katrina Dawson, was killed by police ricochet bullets. So Mons had shot the manager of Lindt Cafe and Katrina was there and she was killed in the hours after. So the weeks later did I start getting insomnia and anxiety attacks, and which later led to a diagnosis of postnatal depression and anxiety. And years of therapy, we unpacked that I probably hadn't digested what was happening and that there was this sort of subconscious or this sadness or empathy with Katrina who lost her life.
Yeah, and I think that's very common for a lot of people who work in news. And as you said, you've been reporting on the ground for years. It's so common for journalists to put that away in the back and not really think about that secondhand trauma, you could say.
Absolutely. And the thing is, because it was not only a national story, it became a story of global significance. And when I wasn't doing regular crosses for SBS, I was doing radio crosses to networks in Asia that I can't even remember. I think I did a cross with CNN or BBC. There were just so many because all around the globe, countries were watching and waiting to see what was going to happen.
When you found out how many hostages were inside, when it kind of, I guess, ended after those 16 hours and it resulted in the deaths of 2 civilians and the gunman, how did you feel?
Obviously incredibly sad, but also relieved that it wasn't anywhere near as bad as it could have been or that people were bracing for. And I don't mean to sound irreverent or I don't mean to downplay the magnitude of any loss of life, but the casualties were far less than what many of us were expecting. I hope that answers the questions without sounding, unsympathetic for the devastating innocent lives that were lost.
Yeah, it could have been much worse. And I remember watching it unfold and I think I was only in year 11 and it was super scary. And now, we're going to 10 years on from this. How do you think we as a country sit with terror compared to how we did then?
Yeah, look, I think even the discussions around terrorism and the labelling of terrorism needs to be contextualised, because in 2014 we were definitely, in the era of a war on terror, which is as much political as it was a real threat. So I think if we go back to Mons and the Lindt Cafe siege, it was definitely terrifying. It was definitely a hostage situation, definitely violent. But it was a news and developing story. And I think it's easy, or it's tempting to jump to the conclusion of is it terrorism? Is it terrorism? And for politicians to jump the gun and call it things without having all of the information at hand. And I think the how and the why comes, and that analysis comes later. It comes when you have more information. It comes when you allow all of the agencies to do the work that they're there to do. But it was a really politically charged time, and it is in those times tempting to jump the gun and label it terrorism. And so I guess what was a little bit confusing is that Mons at the Lindt Cafe siege, yes, he was a violent and unhinged man. He was on bail for multiple sex offences. He was charged with being an accessory to the murder of his former partner, but he had no links to terror groups. He didn't even have an online search history that's suggesting he was even sniffing around terrorism. He gave, to be fair, the media the bum steer when he announced that it was an attack by the Islamic State. But Arabic speakers and Islamic experts were quick to point out that the flag that he was displaying was not an IS flag. Yes, it was Arabic writing and another Islamic flag, but it wasn't linked to IS, which was, a huge enemy of Western powers. So it didn't add up.
He was called a terrorist at the time, and by many still is. And Australia's counter-terrorism laws define terrorism as an act or a threat to act that meets the following criteria. This is what they have. So it's done with the intention of advancing a political, religious or ideological cause, or it's done with the intention to intimidate the public or coerce or influence by intimidation any government. And this is just a few that I've picked out. And it causes one or more of the following: death, serious harm, or endangers the life of a person, or poses a serious risk to the public. And that's just to name a few there that relates to this incident. And it was declared an act of terrorism by the Australian government. And as I said, many Australians would call it that. So would you agree with this?
I think, as I said, he did the kind of the bum steer by making claims and displaying a flag. I couldn't even get the flag right. I do want to point to a paper published in 2018, and that was published in the Journal of Psychiatry, Psychology and Law. And Roger Shanahan is one of the authors, and he's kind of a leading thinker in terrorism and Middle Eastern study. He said that despite Mons's professed status as a Shiite Muslim cleric, that was fraudulent. And a forensic examination of his use of the internet and social media found no evidence that Mons had any contact with Islamic State or any other terror organisation. He only had 12 followers on Twitter. The evidence does not support the conclusion that Monis suddenly was radicalised and committed an act of terrorism. Instead, the evidence shows that Monis was a malignant narcissist whose behaviour can be formulated as a lone actor grievance-fuelled violence. I am not a terrorism expert, but I am wary of the politicisation of acts of violence and the damage that this can actually be done to social cohesion and the terror it can actually instill in the masses. So following the Bondi attacker, he wasn't classed as a terrorist. Was it terrifying? Yes. Was it violent? Yes. Were there many victims? Yes. And there have been some arguments that given he attacked women, like he went for women, and that any male casualties were men like those security guards who came to protect women, does he have an ideology? And is his ideology misogyny? Should that be counted as a ideology under the definition of terrorism? And so what I would say is that the definition of terrorism is a moving beast.
Yes.
And that it can be politicised. And I think it's really important to scrutinise it. And I think the media has a really important role to scrutinise it as well.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up the Bondi Junction stabbings, because this year, many people have argued that should be a terrorist attack, or it should be classified as that. We're in 2024. We've seen 97 women killed this year to domestic violence, and that's been reported by Femicide Watch. Again, 10 years on, if you asked an Australian what a terrorist looks like, do you think that their opinion has changed?
I don't. I think they think a terrorist looks like a person with a beard, a person with olive skin, a person of Middle Eastern appearance. And that's despite the fact that for the past, I'd say, decade, the biggest rise in threats of terrorism has been by the far right and neo-Nazis. And despite the fact that ASIO, our chief intelligence body, has come out and said things to that effect over several years, that's when the politicisation and media coverage shapes public opinion. And it can be at odds with what the evidence shows. It's probably also why we're not at a point where we can discuss domestic violence or attacks on women like the Bondi attacker as a potential act of terrorism.
And after the siege, the hashtag I'll Ride With You went viral to show support for Muslim Australians catching public transport or just kind of being out in public, that if they were visibly Muslim and they felt unsafe. What was the fallout for the Muslim community after this day?
Yeah, look, I'm not a member of that community, so I can't speak personally, but I will share a study. And what this study did was it analysed more than a dozen sermons given across a bunch of mosques in Sydney in the aftermath. And it said that community leaders, that the incident was condemned, that it was considered un-Islamic, that the perpetrator was mentally ill, that his victims were innocent, and that the congregation were told that the consequence of killing innocent people, is eternal damnation. And some of the sermons acknowledged that non-Muslims may be confused and have a negative view of Islam. And members of the congregation were asked to actually reach out to non-Muslims and demonstrate that Islam is a religion of peace.
10 years on from the day, do you still think about this moment?
Absolutely. Every time I'm in Martin Place, I think about the Lindt Cafe siege. And I wish my wish had come true when I was leaving home and going to work, that I wish it was a slow news day, because that would mean Tori would still be here. It would mean Katrina would still be here. And all of those hostages who were forever changed, they wouldn't have had to experience that trauma.
Antoinette, thank you so much for sharing and being on your show, our show.
Thank you.
That was The Briefing's Antoinette Lattouf. Thanks for listening to this episode of The Briefing. That's it for now. Before you go though, we'd love it if you could share this ep with someone else you think might want to hear it as well. If you want to keep up with our other content, you can check us out on Instagram at The Briefing Podcast and on TikTok and YouTube. Just search for Listener Newsroom. And we'll be back in your feed with another episode this afternoon from 3. I'm Helen Smith. See you next time.
Listener.